Okay, everyone, I think we'll make a start then. It's great to see you all here. A very warm welcome. My name's Paul Jones. I'm one of the co-editor of Sociological Review Journal, and I'm also one of the editors of the digital platform of Sociological Review, the monthly magazine. It features all sorts of blogs and different types of visual sociologies. And I guess just as well as working with the Sociological Review, I'm also a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Liverpool. My research tends to focus actually on architecture and the built environment, changing nature of cities. That's particularly what I'm interested in. So I teach and research at the University of Liverpool, as well as doing some editorial work for the Sociological Review. Delighted to be joined today by Charlie Rumsby, who, Charlie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here today. I'm the current Sociological Review Fellow, and it's been an awesome year, actually, having a space to write and being supported to write by the journal. So I just want to say thank you very much for that. The fellowship that I'm on is hosted at Keele University, so that's where I am affiliated at the moment, and I'm also a visiting fellow at the LSE Anthropology Department. My background is I'm an interdisciplinary researcher, and I use multimodal methodologies. So I work with film and digital illustration, soundscapes, and the like. And I'm a anthropologist, I think, by birth, and then sort of like have moved into like more sociology, geography. But I have conducted ethnographic research as a sort of mainstay of how I conduct my practice. And I've worked in Cambodia now for around 6 years with a group of stateless children. And it's been an amazing longitudinal piece of research where I've basically been asking questions about how do people belong in circumstances of invisibility. And that's what I'm currently writing my monograph about as well. And if you're interested to know more about my research, you can check out my website, a little shameless plug. It's charlierumsby.com. I'm sure you've already been on it. Jokes. But it's just really great to have you here today and really looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. So just a few organizational things before we begin. First thing to note is the session is being recorded. The reasons for that are effectively we're going to put it up and host the session up on the Sociological Review's YouTube channel, because there are lots of people who, because of time zones and care and responsibilities, who have expressed that they would have liked to have been here, but they can't make it. So we will be recording for that purpose. The other thing to say is that, as Charlie hinted at, we'd very much like this session to really be a collaborative one, and to be organised around some discussion across us all. Now, how we do that is kind of up to you. So Charlie and I are going to make some shortish statements at the start of the session. Just drawing out a few key points as we understand it about academic judgment. And then what we'd like to do is just to open it up to sort of a full group discussion, really. If you'd like to contribute, if you have questions, reflections, you can either stick up your virtual hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask questions that way. Or if you want to pop questions directly into the chat, that's great too. If you do want to contribute in that way, great, hope you do. But just let us know before you ask your question, either in the chat or on Zoom. Just let us know who you are, where in the world you're joining us from, and sort of what your research is about. Then that should helpfully sort of smooth the conversation as we go. Just again, at the risk of repeating myself, we're absolutely delighted that you're all here today, and I hope this is the start of kind of, you know, an ongoing discussion about academic judgment. Now, I sort of nominally came up with the idea for this event in discussion with my colleagues at the journal, including Charlie, because, well, I've come to the conclusion that academic judgment is one of the sort of, it's both at the same time, it's central to academic research, but it's also not very much spoken about. You know, it's in danger of becoming kind of a normalized feature of the academic landscape, but it's something that we don't really illuminate, I think, as thoroughly as we could do. So I think in the session today, it's not so much about, well, it's not so much about answers. It's as much about opening up some reflection on the role that academic judgment plays in our careers, in our work, in the research space. So again, a sort of exploratory discussion, and it's one that's quite difficult, I think, to have, because we are effectively asking for a sociological reflection on our own practice, because we are all, by definition, we are all judging the academic work of others, and we are also ourselves being judged. So there's a kind of I guess an invitation to being reflexive about some of the assumptions that we usually make about our roles within the discipline. I've got 3 points I want to make, really, by way of a statement. But before I do that, and Charlie knows this, I feel the need to tell you all that I had a journal article rejected this very morning. I may refer back to that in the course of our conversations. Anyway, 3 points. So the first point that I want to make is that academic judgment is social. It's something that we do in a group, and it's something that creates certain patterns as well. So if we're thinking about a sociology of academic judgment, we're really trying to move beyond an account that would see academic judgment as just existing between individuals. There's something collective about academic judgment. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not random. So I guess my own perspective would be that, you know, the social phenomena such as academic judgment, they create certain patterns. You know, certain patterns become normalized. These are not entirely random events. So number one, I want to say that academic judgment is social. And you know, if we think about some of the spaces of academic judgment that we all operate in, so whether that's undergraduates writing essays, whether it's, you know, some of us who teach marking essays, assessment scripts, whether it's acting as anonymous peer reviewers, whether it's writing articles, whether it's writing a PhD, whether it's acting as an external for a PhD viva. There are all sorts of spaces where academic judgment happens. You know, now my first point is that we do not go into these spaces as lone individuals. We do it both as people exercising academic judgment. We do that as a group, and we are judged with respect to our position within the group. So that's point number one I want to make. Academic judgment is social. Point number two I want to make is that academic judgment rests on a claim to some kind of authority, some kind of quote unquote scientific expertise. So one of the defining characteristics of academic judgment is precisely that we are judging from a position of relative expertise, right? We don't necessarily know more than the person that we are judging, but we understand enough about the field, the context of operation, to exercise judgment in a conscribed and careful way. So academic judgment, we're not talking about judgment of people, we're talking about judgment of research. And of course, we're talking about judgment that emerges from our research specialisms. So, you know, if I were to ask Charlie whether you like the colour of this wall, Charlie, what? Oh, okay. Oh.
What is it like? Is it a baby blue or a green?
It's
sort of sea green.
It's Swedish blue, actually.
It's all right, yeah.
Thanks, Charlie. All right. Well, you can express an opinion about that, but that's not an academic judgment. That's a judgment, right? So, you know, if I were to ask you something about your research field or doing visual anthropology, then your judgment would grow from a place of engagement with that part of the field, that subfield, right? So when we think about academic judgment, we are really, we are dealing, not directly, but by proxy, we are dealing with questions of authority. Have you got the authority to judge this thing? Really important question, I think, for academic judgment. So that's point number two that I'd like to make. Academic judgment rests on claims to authority. Right? And my final point, point number three, is that you'll notice that I haven't defined academic judgment yet. I haven't actually said what it is. But I think that the difficulty is that it's very elusive. So attempts to clarify the nature of academic judgment, the creation of metrics, transparencies around process, they often create this black box of academic judgment, because it's very difficult to articulate some rules that would explain exactly what's going on within that black box. So the process can be completely clear, but it involves this space of academic judgment that is typically not well articulated, that is little understood, I think. So there's something internal about academic judgment, and making technical rules about what it is or what it should be doesn't help us understand the social basis of it. It doesn't help us understand the political sets of judgments that characterize it. Just to give you one example of this problem, the office of the independent adjudicator. So in the UK, this is the body that students complain to or make appeals to about the nature of their degree. Now, students cannot appeal academic judgment, right? The office for this independent adjudicator says that the only basis for appeal that will be upheld is an appeal of material irregularity of process. So something's gone wrong with the process. What happens within the space of academic judgment is not admissible to appeal or overturn. So this particular agency suggests there are some very interesting things folded into this definition. Academic judgment is not any judgment made by an academic. It is judgment that is made about a matter where the opinion of an academic expert is essential. So, for example, this could be a judgment about marks awarded, about a degree classification, about the appropriateness of a methodology, about whether feedback is correct and adequate, and the content or outcomes of a course. These things involve academic judgment. So it's not telling you formalistically what those things need to be. That's open to us judging as a community. So I think within academic judgment, we've got this fundamental problem of fuzziness, right? So I guess just to conclude my third point, that technical or legalistic definition of academic judgment, they don't satisfy us sociologically. They just compound the opaqueness of the space. Final things to say. So from these 3 points, I'd just like to make some reflections, really, that sociologists, we need every human, not just sociologists. We need categories to be able to move on in the world. We need categories to be able to do anything, really. And academic judgment is a category that that we use in universities in all sorts of ways. So I guess my sociological imagination thinks it's interesting to look at the times when academic judgment is actually being deployed, not to decide whether that's good judgment or poor judgment, but just to look at the ways in which this type of value-based judgment is put to work in the context of sociology. Now, I said at the very start that academic judgment does not involve the judgment of other individuals. Academic judgment must pertain to something really specific, a specific piece of work, a journal article, an assessment, a grant application. It's not a thoroughgoing analysis of everyone. So I think what I'd like to say by conclusion is that when we are in a position to exercise academic judgment, it needs to be done in a careful, humble, and conscribed way. So they're just my sort of scattered reflections, really. 3 points and a few sketchy points emerging from those 3 headline things. So I can see there are some questions in the chat. Great, thanks. I'll hand over now though to Charlie, and then we can open up to a wider discussion after your statement, Charlie. Thanks so much.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. I think that's an amazing question, Karen. Actually, I'm looking forward to discussing that as someone who does transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research myself. It's interesting, actually, your take on it, Paul, because I think I'm reflecting more on the fact that people and cultures will definitely shape the experience of judgment, and whether academic judgment is purely reflective of a matrix or a criteria from which we judge people against, whether that be for promotion, for publication, for any other career opportunity. Maybe I'm just a bit of a feeler, but for me, the academic judgment is sometimes unspoken, or people kind of take on the judgment in a very personal, subjective way. And I think often that's because we are often really wedded to our research, and we put a lot of energy into it. We make a lot of sacrifices to do research, especially if you've got commitments elsewhere. If I reflect on my short academic career, there have been seasons where I've worked around the clock trying to attain some form of positive judgment in order to then get myself into a different position. And that is usually securing a job as an early career researcher. And therefore, I've had a lot of time to reflect on like the boundaries of judgment and how you embody judgment, and then how that then makes you productive in a certain kind of way, whether that's overworking, underworking because you're paralyzed by the judgment that you think you might face or you have already faced, or just being gutted because you haven't received positive judgment. Whatever it is, I've been reflecting on actually the cultures of judgment and what I hope people can adopt as a precursor to judgment, even if that judgment is very kind of structured, accountable, and necessary. I believe in academic judgment. I think it breeds good quality if it's done right. And I think it can stretch us as thinkers, hold us accountable for things that we say about others. So we definitely need judgment. It definitely needs to be there. It needs to be reflexive. It needs to be transparent, and it needs to be accountable. But having said that, I think that empathy is a precursor to judgment that is often not really kind of spotlighted in conversations. And by empathy, I mean the ability to think about the person as a person before you judge them, and if you're the person judging. So it's to essentially like not see judgment as a dehumanized process. Like we all come to these spaces, our workspaces, as individuals, as peoples with histories, with positionalities, with thoughts and feelings. And whilst of course there needs to be some separation professionally from like what might be going on inside, let's say, I think that if we don't have empathy, we're in danger of actually not even resisting the types of judgment that we find right now as academics. So I'm an early career researcher, and one of the things that I've noticed is that in order for me to basically progress in my career, I have to be a very individual thinker, even when I'm working in teams. And I don't really like it, because I'm in this, in the UK at least, I feel like I'm in this sort of system that is very sort of neoliberal. It champions me as the individual who gets stuff done. It's amazing when I tweet, oh, I've just had this article come out, and everyone's like, you're amazing. And I'm like, yeah, no sweat. But actually, like, often there's been a period of me interacting with other people where I'm asking them to review my work before I submit it to a journal. And I've been very lucky actually in my career so far that I have had people that I've been able to generate academic solidarity with, to loosen and dilute this culture of competition and actually just to collaborate in general. But I know that takes a level of confidence to even step out and do that. Like I've actually mentored students who have come into the UK context from outside, and their academic culture is such that you wouldn't even ask your supervisor questions, because the professor's a bit of a kind of like demigod, and to do that would be a bit too needy or a bit of a disturbance. And that is one of the things that's kind of made me feel quite passionate about from the outset as teachers, as researchers, when we're working in teams, is to think about ways that we can use empathy as a precursor to judgment in order to create this solidarity, which I think the institutional context of the UK right now absolutely needs massively. Secondly, I think empathy is really important to guide people through judgments, because when you get rejected, wherever you get rejected in life, is never fun, is it? It's never a nice feeling. And actually, some of the biggest rejections I've got in sort of academic judgment in terms of article writing and things like that, whilst it's been difficult at times, has actually made me better in the long term. But I've actually, again, been very fortunate to have people who have come alongside me and done what you've done, Paul, and just outright say, look, I'm like way ahead of you in my career, and I still face this sort of judgment and this sort of rejection. And it can feel really personal because of the time and energy that you invest in your outputs, and also because of the people whose stories you've been able to like have the absolute privilege of listening to, taking, re-representing. And it's kind of a bit annoying actually that you have this like really beautiful research experience where you've had the absolute privilege of being in people's spaces, being in people's lives, and you're saying to them, I will basically, ethically, whatever your parameters are, take your stories and share them so that we can understand different types of phenomenon. So when you kind of like invest so much in it and then you get your first line of rejection, you're not just thinking about, am I not a good writer? You're thinking about, am I ever going to be able to do what I said I was going to do to people whose lives I've literally just been invested in for years and years in some cases. So I think as colleagues, it's really good for us to recall our own experiences of judgment, and remember what it felt like, because I think sometimes, especially when you're on a roll of success, you can kind of forget because you've got all the, the good feels of like actually achieving something. And I think it's really important not to reproduce damaging cultures of judgment. And I've definitely witnessed this over the years. Often people just don't complain when they feel they've been, judged or unfairly treated. And, whether that's because of hierarchy or anything like that. So that's not necessarily like, judgment as a sort of like something you can look at by metrics, but sometimes you just feel judged in the spaces that you're in. And this basically leads me to my third point, which is about empathy as a precursor to judgment, to enable us to walk in other people's shoes. And for me, positionality is really strong here as a working class researcher. My first experiences of academia were very much like, I just don't belong here. I sounded very different back then when I sort of walked into my first degree from Coventry Council Estate. First person to go to university in my family, but also recognizing that I'm already in a position as privileged as, a white woman. But having said that, there have definitely been moments like, even just like small things that are just like insanely annoying, like people correcting the way that you speak, and not really like even appreciating that where you're from, you might just have like a localized taxonomy. Just to give you a bit of an example here, in Coventry, when you say someone's ignorant, it means that they're rude. It doesn't mean that they're without knowledge. And everyone uses that word like that. And I remember saying it when I went to uni, and they were like, that's not ignorant. And I was like, well, yeah, it is. I was thinking that they're really rude. And then, and it was just the kind of the way that you can make people feel. That's like kind of really arbitrary example. But I think students, even seeing students now as consumers, that's how like students are being even trained to see themselves. They've paid £9,000 a year. They ought to get something. And you just better do your job to make sure that they finish their degree. We can often, that process of relationship, and you were talking about judgment being social, I think as teachers, as colleagues, we need to basically really reflect on the fact that people aren't going to be coming into the university context where you're coming from. And, there is a lot more people in, at least in the universities I've worked in, they've become very diverse spaces. But there are other universities that I've worked in which it's just not diverse, frankly, like in terms of class anyway. So yeah, they're the three things really under that overarching banner of empathy as a precursor to judgment, to generate academic solidarity, to dilute this competitive culture, to help guide people through judgment. So don't forget your own experience of being judged, and create cultures of encouragement. And then I think to use empathy to enable us to walk in other people's shoes. And, I think just being upfront about where you're from is a very clear and like easy way to do that. I don't remember anyone actually doing that when I was doing any of my degrees. But it would have been amazing, because I notice now when I front who I am, when I'm teaching, it just breaks down this sort of hierarchy, which is also just a little bit, I just find it really boring anyway. And it just breaks down and dilutes academic celebrity, which can actually make judgment really challenging, especially when it's about complaint or like holding someone to account for their bad behavior. And if you're ever on Twitter, you see that all the time. People get outed, and then you're like, what? Everyone references that one person. Turns out they're a jerk. So I think it's good to kind of like just be a bit more open about the humanness of where we're all coming from in this line of work that we're in. Great, I'll hand back to you, Paul. Obviously, if anyone has anything that they'd like to ask, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you and enable that. And the chat is active. So yeah, feel free.
Great, Charlie. Thank you so much. Fascinating. So just over to everyone. I know there's some comments in the chat. If anyone wants to ask a question, if you just pop your hand up, or the chat's open if you want to type in. So it's up to you.
Paul, do you want to pick up Karen's question?
Oh, yes, sorry, Karen. Oh, yeah. In short, yes, great point. I mean, I would even push that a little bit further, Karen. You know, like some of the things that Charlie was talking about is that, you know, hierarchies get dispositions and social position get folded into those hierarchies as well, right? You know, as well as like disciplinary expertise. It's also certain types of bodies, certain types of social characteristics are also disproportionately in positions of judgment on other types of body. And I think that the thing is, I hadn't thought of interdisciplinarity, but that's evidently one of the spaces where judgment starts to appear less authoritative, perhaps. Is that right, Karen? Have I got you?
Yeah. What I'm just very interested in is one of the things as well, in terms of us all being sort of socially conditioned to take expertise, and we've got our own sort of formation of what is an expert and who we will listen to. What can be very difficult is, so I research labour markets and educational pathways, so like that intersection across the economic and the educational. And what you can see is sometimes it is a complex space, and sometimes you can get comments or feedback, and it's trying to unpick, is this a judgment that is not wrong, in that, you know, because there is no wrong judgment. Is it an observation which maybe has slightly missed the mark, or is it an observation that doesn't understand the space, or is this an observation that maybe is based on prior structures which have changed? It can be really difficult to take those judgments and to process them and to hold on. You know, talking, Charlie, about being confident about what it is you know and what you are researching. I think it's about that, isn't it? When you're setting out, because although I'm old, I'm an early career researcher, I'm doing my PhD, it's how do you navigate that, I think, in terms of what you take account of and what you might actually push back on and have that authority to do so. Yeah.
I just say one other thing about that, kind, because there's so much there. This isn't a setup, by the way, but I've the book that I'm rereading at the moment is by Bourdieu, Homo Academicus. He talked exactly about this, the process of being judged on things that are nothing to do with your intellectual labour, but they're actually to do with your class, your age, your gender, sexuality, ethnicity. You know, these social things get read into what are formally judgments about work, about your research, and I think that those types of judgments are by definition illegitimate. I mean, Bourdieu calls them symbolically violent. You know, when other types of things get folded into judgments about, they're supposed to be about this, but they bring in a little bit of that too. The thing I wanted to say is that I realise now, and this is my shallow positionality, as a man in the middle of my 40s who's been doing sociology for a long time, people never give me advice anymore about anything, and trust me, I need advice. I need advice to help me make my research better, to become a better teacher, you know, to become the best colleague that, you know, people would want to work with. You need that. I think as an early career researcher, you become like an experimental terrain. People tell you what you should be doing all the time. You know, where you should publish, why you need to do this, you know, if you and you get lots and lots of advice masquerading as academic judgment, and that's precisely to do with those hierarchies that you drew attention to in your question. I think Charlie, have you got anything you want to chip in?
Yeah, I will say as well, like with an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach, I'd gone from always being in an anthropology department to then all of a sudden being in a sort of interdisciplinary space. And Karen, maybe this would be encouraging for you, but for me, it felt like I was digging and digging and digging and thinking, I don't know where I'm going, because there's just the breadth of literature is so broad and I can draw from all manner of things. And I did feel a little bit lost in the beginning, but then I think just by carrying on, there was a moment where I just hit the foundation at the bottom of my dig, if you like. And then I was like, okay, I can settle here and this is where now I'm going to build from. I think that the moment that we're in, people are kind of want you to be interdisciplinary, but I don't think structurally we've got really solid processes for supervision, let's say, or even judgment. And I was actually running a workshop at Warwick University. They have this it's actually amazing transdisciplinary global development research centre, and just working with PhD students to kind of understand how they understand transdisciplinarity. And, you know, they're all like, they've got one supervisor in this department, one supervisor in that department, and they're coming at them with their, you know, siloed experiences depending on their discipline. And I would just say that there is a moment where judgment and advice actually needs to pause and let the academic and the thinker and the person who's like carrying their baby, if you like, you know, carrying, you know, their research, actually start to make some decisions for themselves. And I think be confident, because at the end of the day, you are the expert on what you're doing once you start doing it, because unless you're replicating a community or an organization that someone has actually interviewed those exact participants, you know, growing in that confidence, Karen, and being like, okay, I trust my nose, as it were, as you're kind of like trying to work out where you're going. But it can be an incredibly frustrating process. Like, I just remember thinking, I'm so lost. And it wasn't until I collected my data, really. And then I realized I'd essentially done a grounded theory approach. But because I was, you know, trained as an anthropologist, I always just thought, well, you actually don't know anything until you get to the field, because that's what anthropology is. And then when I was in you questions and you need to have this and this, and I was just like, wow, this is a bit overwhelming. Hopefully though, being the forerunner, Karen, in the future, when everyone's just doing interdisciplinary research, because they can see that it's actually quite useful to have fluid boundaries, especially when you're like saying something about someone, the stuff that you and I end up writing will be the stuff that people lean into.
Thank you. That's lovely. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Are there any other questions, reflections?
And just to say, I put some questions in the chat pool that were pre-circulated, if anyone wants to have a read of those and use it as a bit of a springboard.
Thanks, Charlie. Can I ask you a question, Charlie?
Yeah? Is it about my background?
No. It's about research and rejection, because that is an outcome of processes that are features of the landscape of our work, right? So not everything always gets accepted, and you know, not everything's always successful, especially if you're doing exploratory types of work and you're taking chances, you know. And I'm asking this fresh from having a paper rejected, but is there an extent, do you think, to which sometimes, like, I leave open the possibility this paper that's been rejected, it's not that good? You know, that like, yeah. So, and I'm not saying that the people who've reviewed it are the objective arbiters of quality, but then again, maybe some of the things that they said actually, like, rather than rejecting them, that's.
Yeah, and I think it's a brave thing to do, but it's really necessary in this line of work. Like, before I submitted my PhD, which was in 2019, I submitted an article as part of a special issue, and I basically just like rehashed a chapter of my thesis and submitted it before I submitted my thesis, and I got like outright rejection. I got like really like not scathing reviews, but they were quite critical. And at the time, I was like, oh, this is really embarrassing, because I'm meant to be like submitting this as part of an issue, right? So I was also like everyone in the group now, and I was the youngest person in the group in terms of career. I've got to know that my work wasn't accepted, and maybe everyone else's was. In the end, we all stuck together and then went to another journal, so that was great. But then when I was reflecting on it, I was like, this is really helpful for me, because this chapter really needs then to be tightened up a little bit. So I definitely recommend throwing a chapter into a journal if you can, because it made me rethink the chapter, which ultimately then made me sort of think about other things, assertions I'd made in the thesis. And my PhD, I'm very proud of it. I had a really amazing viva. And that article I then rewrote. It took about 4 years though, and this is the thing about time as well. We have to think about that judgment is like temporal, and sometimes you can rework judgment over years. And I've did this paper that was like outright rejected has now just recently been published, but that was like 4 years in the making. But you know, I think it is really important. Like, I don't think, I mean, unless someone is just an absolute like whatever, I don't think people are writing these reviews in a kind of like malicious way. Often, you know, you're given a couple of hours of your time and you're just trying to be really quick and really thorough. And, you know, people forget to sort of put in the niceties sometimes. So I try now just to kind of look at it as this is actually really good and it could help me grow. Like my most recent article, I got like significant revisions, but it really helped me. Theoretically, it stretched me so much. So I'm like really grateful now, because actually I don't think I'd pushed myself enough, but I know I've got it in me. So sometimes it can bring out the gold. But, you know, I think there comes a stage, especially for early career researchers, and this is something I've been thinking about now, like I'm going to be soon on the job market again. You know, I've realized that it's quite tempting to just wrap up your identity in academia, especially when you've given like 7 years of your life to it. And I'm now making sort of like, I'm kind of like feeling, you know, how much do I actually really want to be like subjected to this kind of judgment when there is like a whole other world out there that I'm totally qualified to enter into, and I could just get on with life. So, you know, I think as well, like it is quite important that we decenter ourselves on what we do, which is incredibly challenging, because so much of what we produce is wrapped up in things that we feel really passionate about, we've got strong feelings about. But at the end of the day, they don't define us point blank. And I think, you know, even training people to think like that and to kind of think about an external reality is quite important, if not very challenging. I can see Chris has got a hand up. Go on, Chris.
Yes, my name is Chris Tan. I'm now in Singapore. I was trained as an anthropologist of gender and sexuality, although in the past couple of years I've switched over to live streaming and new media in general. So I have graduated for a number of years now. So over the years I have discovered that in order to be an academic, your skin has to be really, really thick. Yeah, because you have to realize that when you get comments from the reviewers, they're not about you. They may sound nasty and everything, but it's not about you. So no matter how bad they sound. So normally these days, when I get rejection, and I still get rejection at my stage, I've been working as an academic for the past 9 years, right? And I still get it quite often. I just look at the comments and see what I can absorb and incorporate into my writing, right? Those that I can, I do so. Those that I can't, I cannot, or I think it's nonsensical, I just ignore. And then I just toss out the edited, the new version of the manuscript to another journal. There's so many journals out there. You know, if you can't publish at this one, go for another one, right? It's not the end all and be all of it. Yeah, so the important thing is that, you know, some of the reviewers out there are really, have said really nasty stuff about me. I remember very early on that when I first started, one reviewer said that I wrote like a graduate student without telling me how do I not write like a graduate student to improve myself? Yeah, so at that point in time, I was very angry and I wanted to complain to the editor, but my friends told me that, Chris, chill about this, just ignore it and then look at the other comments and see how you can improve yourself. Oftentimes, if you pit yourself against the reviewers with the editor would likely choose to side with the reviewers and not you. Yeah, so I should not be losing sleep for this, right? Just ignore the bad comments and then move on. Yeah, that's my advice.
Thank you, Chris. Chris, that's a perfect setup as well, because this session today is the third of our 4 sociological review summer sessions. And next Monday, between 1 and 2, there's an event about responding to reviewer feedback. That will address precisely some of the issues. This is such an important issue. I think that maybe without getting too technical, the way we work, my editorial role at the Sociological Review involves making decisions about reviewers' comments. So which ones of the comments are the headline ones that we're going to ask Chris or the author to respond to? So there are. I think that's one of the interesting things with academic judgment, that it's not a flat space. It doesn't just exist between the judger and the judged, but actually it's a complicated intersubjective, there's a collective process going on there. You're making judgments about what to incorporate. You've made academic judgments initially about how to articulate your argument, what your original contribution is going to be, what methodology to make. They're all within the space of academic judgment. So I think that response to reviewers, that's another kind of really, really acute space where academic judgment is operative.
Yeah. In one of the more recent papers that I managed to get published, the reviewers gave us a hard time. I was working as a team, right? And one of the reviewers was very picky, and he or she was giving us a very hard time. And in my response, because I was writing the response letter, I was actually fighting back. My team collaborator told me, Chris, you need to reword that. You do not want to take off the reviewer. Otherwise, that person might just, reject you outright.
But I think the other thing to say is these are spaces of interpretation. It's not that there's like a right or wrong, set of judgments about things, that they are nuanced and they are relational, I guess. Thanks, Chris. Karen, okay. Did you have your hand up as well?
I was just clapping Chris, to be honest, to say well done. It sounded a very positive attitude to life. Yeah. Well,
yeah, totally. And
I think Alice had her hand. Did you have your hand up, Alice, at one point? Go on, the floor is yours. Let me unmute,
yeah.
There you go.
What we're doing.
I think I've done it. Have I done it?
You've done it. Hi, Alice. How are you?
Hi, Paul. Good to see you, mate. How are you getting on?
Nice to meet you again.
Yeah. Good. I'm really enjoying this whole conversation. I'm finding it very provoking. I'm also finding it kind of like there's something icky about this whole situation, in my view, because whilst what Chris is saying is very like wise and helpful on a level to, take what you can from the experience and ignore the very like vitriolic or insensitive comments, and don't fight back in your response letters, because then you're definitely going to get put in the bin. And certainly the editor is much more likely to side with the reviewers than you. This bespeaks of, in my mind, a huge problem. That's a huge problem. I don't think that it's the right response to ignore abuses of power. Like if you're walking down the street, for example, and you see some abuse of power, some like racist heckling or something, the thing to do is not to ignore it, because silence is a very close cousin to complicity. And we're all here talking in a way that is still so couched in this neoliberal, like how to optimize ourselves in this very crap situation. Like all academics, really, I'm not offering any kind of solution here or like, here's another way that we should do it. But I just don't like it, man. I just don't like that reviewers can offer you unkind, unempathetic, irrelevant feedback, which you are structurally sort of obliged to comply with, at least to the extent that you have to perform your gratitude for their like poor behavior, otherwise you know that you can't get published with them, and all that kind of thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And oh, sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Sorry, Charlie, go on.
I was just saying, like, I had recently there's a journal called Entanglements. It's come out of Goldsmiths, and it's actually not a blind peer review. So I knew who was reviewing my papers, and I was in direct dialogue with the peer reviewers, and it was the most pleasant experience I've ever had. It was equitable, it was free, it was helpful, it was kind, and it's open access as well. It's multimodal journal. And I do think that actually, like, we could do a lot more in terms of like disrupting and questioning some of these, like you said, sort of like salient but very pervasive structures that enable certain types of judgment. And that's not throwing the metrics out or the quality out of the window.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very interesting point. I think that your original question, Alice, I mean, when we review or we are being reviewed, that's an expression of our connection to the community. So, you know, all those things that Charlie said initially about empathy and about remembering the social and the human bonds that we share, because we're all doing something similar, you know, we're all operating in the same research space. That's dead important. So the kind of like the terrible reviewer who is, you know, bullying and arrogant and high-handed and dismissive, and I'm sure that person exists, right? But I've been involved with sociological review for 4 years now, and I can say with my hand on my heart that none of the reviewers that have ever submitted reviews for papers that I've been processing have been like that at all. They've been generous, they've been helpful, they've been supportive. So I get it that the bad ones, it's not even like negative reviews. It's when the reviewer is not kind of playing by the rules. You know, they're not being held to the high standards that we should all hold each other to. And that's the same when we are reviewing or we're being reviewed. So I think that your point, I mean, you know, because if Chris's point is that the end point, like getting published, is the instrumental aim that we're trying to get to. Well, I don't think that's, you know, that if that's the starting point, then there are like games that one would play to make sure you get that article out. But I think really thinking about it as a community of practice, let's say, that might make us think about the way in which we're relating to each other through judgments. And again, that's to undergraduate students as much as it is to senior professors in the field, you know. Yeah, I know what you say. I know what you're saying, Alice. I do, but I think that this question of academic judgment, in my mind at least, it's a sociological problem. It's not kind of like how to. It's more like what is, you know, like what is that space?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I suppose my ultimate question is what are the power imbalances that we are participating in and co-creating by engaging in this project where reviewers are like protected by anonymity and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you do feel like pressured as well, because you know, it's not just your output for the sake of output. Oftentimes it's like your output for a job or like to continue on for many people. I think it's quite funny as well how, like, you know, looking at this as a sociological problem, Paul, just how people have like caricatured reviewer 2 as a cathartic, humorous thing to basically like deal with it. Do you know what I mean? Because everyone's been scorned by reviewer 2, so let's make light of it because we're all basically like burdened and wounded.
But it's like, I mean, I'm going to attend next week's session. I'm not one of the facilitators, but it'll be a really great discussion, I'm sure. But reviewer 2 is like a bogey person who like,
the archetype,
all the bad things that have ever. It's like a composite character, you know, an ideal type. Well, you know, and those people are also disarmingly easy to disagree with because they're operating very poorly. If they do exist, you know, because they're not exercising academic judgment in a collegial, careful, developmental way. Quite the opposite. So it's sort of like the space of academic judgment that could be far more collegial, that could be far less individualistic. That well is poisoned by that type of character and arguably by representations of that character. I'm not mounting a defensive reviewer 2 here, by the way, for the record. Okay, thanks, Karen.
Good nice to meet you, Karen.
Actually, what time is it? So, we're just about rounded up. So if anyone's got any final questions or comments, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Angelo.
Okay, thanks, Alice.
Hello, I'm Angelo Bernardo from the Philippines, University of the Philippines. Actually, I'm an undergrad, so those questions about is my paper actually bad? I feel like I'm not that sociologically legible in the way I write. I feel like I believe it was Chris who mentions the reviewer making a comment about how a person writes like a graduate student. I feel like I'd be far worse if I'm undergrad, but I'm basically here I'm basically here and I'm very thankful to participate, to know in the future what to look forward to, stuff like that. In my class and even in the undergraduate level, you're not you're especially more susceptible to academic judgment, and sometimes they're not the nicest academic judgments either. Especially in my position, I mean, I'd hate to say in my country, but sometimes there's we're not as sensitively sometimes we're not as sensitive to the people's positions, especially the older generations most of the time. I had one class, I believe, where where the first few weeks we were just throwing research topics and research questions, presenting it to the professor, and the professor would always shoot them down, and for weeks it felt like we were never getting anywhere. So that's what was happening in that class, and it felt like very similar to what is going on here, except you just spent a lot of years in your life in the field and to get such mean comments, and I sort of agree. Basically, I'm here because I have goals of submitting my abstract, my final output. It's called a thesis to the conferences, and I want to make sure that I can get it right. So I found this place through Facebook, actually, the Facebook Sociological Review, and I joined. That's how I found the place, looking for opportunities, which I'm grateful for. It's a good seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelo, and you're very welcome. Thanks so much for the comment. I think that one of the other things, the takeaway points is that you know, in your position as an undergraduate student, you too are exercising academic judgment. Every time you write a paper, if you're going to present this thesis, or you're writing a thesis, they're two academic judgments that lead to you pulling those things together. So yeah, well, good luck with that. It's a very good point to end on. I guess if there are no more questions, yeah, so all that remains is for us to thank you all very much for joining and for contributing. good luck with it all, and I hope we get the chance to continue some of these conversations in the future. So
See you
thanks
later.
very much, everyone. Cheers for now.
Bye.
Bye.